Now, let's turn our attention to the migration planning phase. Phase F, or the migration planning phase, is the last step in the process that began at architecture vision phase and led to architecture development iteration. And this phase represents the completion of one iteration of this process. After this phase, the architecture developed gets picked up by implementation teams within various implementation projects, or the architecture goes through further ADM cycles for further elaboration. Hence, the objectives of this phase is oriented towards ensuring alignment to the strategic vision and goals, and also in tying up all the loose ends before transitioning over. So, in this phase, the focus is therefore on finalizing the solution building blocks, finalizing work packages and their sequence and priorities, and also to ensure that both architecture and project priorities, where it is being moved to implementation, are being met by these building blocks. To evolve and obtain endorsements for architecture roadmap and transition architectures arrived in phase E with relevant stakeholders. And to evolve the migration plan collaboratively with stakeholders to a point where the plan can be considered practically achievable, and also to ensure that it is in alignment with the various management frameworks that are being used within the enterprise. Now, let's look at some of the key steps taken typically to fulfill these objectives of phase F. As described earlier, one of the key outcomes aimed for in this phase is the migration plan. So hence, the strawman migration plan that was created in phase E is validated further in this phase to ensure alignment with other enterprise frameworks that are in use. This might include IT service management frameworks such as ITIL, or IT governance frameworks such as COBIT, or project and portfolio management frameworks such as Prince2, SAFe, LESS, etc. The next possible step to identify the resources that are needed to realize architectural objectives and to reflect the same against each activity within each work package. A technique such as business value assessment might be used to identify business value of each work package as well, and hence assign relative priorities to various projects. Subsequently, it is also important to gain consensus across stakeholders on the prioritized list of projects. And finally, adjust the migration plan, the architecture definition document, the architecture roadmap, etc. to reflect the new understanding based on the consensus obtained. At this point, the architecture may be considered complete and can therefore be transitioned over to implementation teams, and hence the focus of the ADM cycle transitions from architecture development to architecture governance. Also, at this point, it may be decided that further architecture development cycles are required to further elaborate the architecture, and hence new iterations may be initiated at this point. And before concluding this phase, the team documents its learnings from the current cycle of ADM so that the process can be improved continually. A technique that was briefly touched upon just then is the business value assessment technique. And as suggested before, it is used to prioritize architecture work packages. This, in conjunction with factors such as dependencies and tactical and operational urgency of the solution, will decide on how the work packages are actually prioritized, sequenced, and executed. The business value assessment basically is a plot of work packages on two indices, the value index and the risk index. The value index is a calculated value, which is in effect a weighted score of a given work package based on criteria such as compliance to the business principles and values, strategic alignment, return on investments, competitive advantage, etc. The risk index similarly is also a calculated value, indicating a weighted risk score, and includes criteria such as complexity of implementation, size of the effort, organizational capacity, learning curve involved, business readiness, external dependencies, and so forth. The criteria that are used by each organization are endorsed and to a great extent even decided by the senior and executive management, and so are the weights associated with each criteria. Let's look at an example of how the weighted indices may be calculated. Let's say WebFirst wants to prioritize one of its enterprise initiative, and for example, let's pick one, say the Web Platform Consolidation Initiative. Let's first take a look at how the value index is arrived at. Let's assume the value criteria endorsed by the management are as shown here. Now, although each criteria is an important consideration, management likes to give higher importance to some over the others, and hence introduce a numeric factor to indicate the relative importance of each, and this typically ranges from 1 to 5, where 5 is the maximum weight and 1 being the least. The unweighted score indicates how aligned and favorable the proposed initiative is when viewed through the lens of each criteria. Let's assume that this score is once again scored on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best outcome and 1 being the worst. So based on these scores, this particular initiative receives a weighted score of 80 out of a maximum of 100. Similarly, the risk profile of this initiative can be identified by first identifying the criteria and associating its weight and identifying the cumulative risk index. So in this case, the risk index of this program is 58. Now the projects are plotted on a graph of value versus risk, and they are typically represented using bubble charts, which also indicates their relative sizes and the status of each initiative. So some of the initiatives may already be in flight, some may be in a proposal stage, and some may be in flight but delayed or blocked for various reasons. Thus, plotting the work packages helps in getting a sense of which initiative presents the best opportunity and the highest bang for the buck, so to speak. As stated earlier, this plot of business value, along with other operational and tactical considerations, are used to identify the relative priorities of the work packages. Now let's move on to describe the inputs and outputs of this phase. Essentially, the migration planning phase is an extension of the phase E, that is the opportunities and solutions phase. You refine and finalize many things that you started creating in phase E, such as the roadmaps, the transition architectures, architecture definitions and requirements, work packages, implementation and migration plan, and so forth. Hence, all the outputs produced by phase E forms the inputs into this phase. This phase primarily produces the following outputs: a finalized and endorsed architecture migration plan, finalized architecture roadmap and transition architectures, finalized architecture definition document, finalized architecture requirement specification, reusable architecture and solution building blocks, request for architecture work for a new iteration where it is required, an implementation governance model. Now that concludes the overview of phase F. Next, let's look at what's happening at WebFirst. We will look at how Tom Weisman is addressing some of the concerns raised by some key stakeholders at WebFirst.